Day 1272 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 1,071,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 890 in the past day. Then as for hardware, no tanks, no APVs, 68 artillery, and 1 rocket launcher, with the Soviet war chest of vehicles that have seen better days than 2025. That is for certain. And on that note, with some of the most recent pass-by imagery coming from the lower resolution Sentinel-2 satellites, showing a sunnier, albeit less clear, view of the medium to large-sized Russian depots of the 6018th and the 2456th storage bases, analysed and to be considered decidedly more vacant. The old storage depot behemoths of the Soviet war chest left hollow and bare. Then to start out today in the US, where President Trump met with President Zelensky one-on-one, then widened the table to Europe's heavyweights in the East Room of the White House yesterday. The message remained focused: security guarantees for Ukraine, not NATO membership, and with the US-backed security guarantees that kick in at a ceasefire or peace deal stage as part of European-led peacekeeping deployments in Ukraine. More specifically, it looks to include a giant weapons pipeline and one of US air and strategic support, but no American troops on the ground. Overall, the event was turning out to be cautiously upbeat. Unlike the drama-rich Zelensky February visit to the White House, and this time, Zelensky wore a suit and expressed even more thank yous than that previous visit. You gotta do what you gotta do. Now, Macron talked permanence and a strong Ukrainian army. Starmer framed Ukraine's defense as Europe's. Rutte said the political deadlock had finally cracked, and Germany's Merz pushed for a ceasefire to shape the next round. It's said that Italy's Meloni was caught rolling her eyes again, but that was more of a freeze-frame picture, as she was very much engaged, speaking positively, citing Ukraine's resilience and calling for Europe to back real guarantees. When the meeting broke, Trump placed a White House call to Putin, confirmed by Kremlin aide Yuri Yushakov, picking up the line, with the offer on the call said to be one of a direct Putin-Zelensky bilateral encounter. Now, reportedly, both sides signaled agreement in principle, with some of these European officials later stating that preparations are underway for a summit within 2 weeks. Although that would need further confirmation, but it does look to be shaping up in that direction, with expectations now hanging on a Putin-Zelensky sit-down. Now, both Moscow and Kyiv have called their conversations with Trump positive, Alaska on Friday, Washington on Monday, but whether this translates into an actual bilateral is squarely in Russia's court now. Certainly a case of don't hold your breath. Putin has rarely rushed into top-level meetings, especially where territorial concessions are concerned. Putin may not be fond of Kyiv statements saying that it is impossible to cede land, but it's worth recalling that Russia's own foreign ministry and Putin himself have often insisted that stepping into negotiations should begin with no preconditions, unless of course they mean no preconditions from the Ukrainian side. Now, one would surely think that such a Putin-Zelensky meeting would throw an unsuspecting spanner in the works, because for the Kremlin, if Putin sits down with Zelensky, then one or some of his core invasion lies collapse, as it would make such a setting impossible to deny Ukraine's sovereignty. Not to mention Putin speaking to the head of Ukraine that contains some Jewish heritage, which doesn't exactly align with Kremlin narratives of a Third Reich-style fascist state. That's a tough balancing act for Russia, a regime forever dodging the shadow of its own lies. Then headed to a mix of map updates today, and back to that news shortly. So, starting out in occupied Luhansk, where Ukraine's SBU drones destroyed 2 Russian ammunition depots in Bilo-Kurikine overnight, some 65 kilometers from the front. NASA satellite data confirmed the fires. The depots had supplied Russian forces on the Pokrovsk axis. Then to Toretsk, where the 12th Azov Brigade of the National Guard successfully repelled a large large-scale Russian assault in the village of Katerinivka, south of. Russian infantry, supported by armored vehicles, attempted to establish positions in the settlement. However, fast responses from the brigade forced the invaders into retreat with the effective use of FPV munitions. And for a region that's quite the garrison, for the Russian forces to plug the gap in, practically sidestepping it to the next direction on the map at Dobropilla, with, for instance, the operation of a Ukrainian rocket artillery battery against Russian positions in the area of Kusherev Yar, smoking them out of their caves, to borrow the borrowed term of former President George W. Bush. And for this region, with the location this activity can be found at in the bunny ears, is more consistent with the updated maps, which have led to no discernible animal-like shape at all, although the comment section is waiting for you. And alongside this map update, with advice that Ukraine has regained the village of Kusherev Yar, with now further clearing operations underway. Then to head further south on the map, and expressed as a big win, with fighters of the 425th Separate Assault Regiment of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, who have driven the enemy out of Dnipropetrovsk in the Novopavlivka direction, and advanced towards the settlement of Troitsk, with further statements that an area of approximately 13 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory has been liberated here. Now to the southwest, with reports of a burning train between the Tokmak and Vasil line, targeted by a few hits this morning. On the ground footage, or very low Earth orbit footage, suggests a head-on quadcopter made a decisive impact on this cargo train. Next, and to head up the map, with another not quite so silent day in Russia's Kursk, at Tyotkino, due to another strike made by a French-supplied aviation-launched AASM hammer munition, further degrading Russian positions operating out of this region. Then also seen around the map, but this time in a different light, with rare footage of a Ukrainian Air Force MiG-29 Fulcrum operating from an improvised highway airstrip, seen here taxiing outside a nearby homeowner's front gate. And then there's the footage of a Ukrainian helicopter pilot that shot down a Russian Shahed drone at night, this one at almost point-blank range. Now back to the news and to the price tag behind the handshake, where coming out of the Trump-Zelensky European leaders meeting, Kyiv added hardware to the handshake, a $100 billion weapons buy, underwritten mostly by Europe and frozen Russian assets, plus a $50 billion drone deal between the US and Ukraine to build at scale on Ukrainian soil. With this co-production deal tying American guarantees to European cash and Ukrainian factories. The trading of Ukrainian territory was not on the table, completely sidelined, with Zelensky committing to negotiating directly with Putin on the case of such territorial concessions in a one-on-one meeting. Then as for more updates on yesterday's meeting on money and leverage, Europe's message had also ran largely in two tracks, keep discussing the use of frozen Russian state assets for compensation and aid to Ukraine, which is already a live issue in Brussels and among transatlantic policy shops, and as always, be ready to tighten sanctions if the Kremlin stalls. That is quite key, more than it sounds, with stalling being the one and only major activity to be found coming out of the Kremlin playbook. So next up, we should expect to see a drafted security guarantee package that Trump stated the US would help stand behind, but again, with NATO membership off the table for now. But as for those Putin-Zelensky talks, it's already been reported that Putin has proposed a meeting with Zelensky in Moscow. Now that might be the fastest way to get Putin to accept a meeting, but also the fastest way for Zelensky to never see the light of day again. That's not going to happen, because speaking of security guarantees, there are none right there. Then to the next piece of news that I could never ignore, as there are a lot of reports circulating right now about how Russian forces have captured just 1% of Ukrainian land over the past 1,000 days of war. So is this true? Absolutely, 100% for that 1%, which is in fact slightly less than 1%. So it's good to see believe that the reality of the situation is finally breaking into the zeitgeist and shared awareness of the broader public. I'm sure many of you would feel the same way. Now, hopefully, the next set of numbers breaks into that same zeitgeist too, because this 1% in 1,000 days figure is actually the version that paints Russia in the best possible light. Because if you rewind just an additional 50 days earlier from that 1,000 day mark, you find that Russia actually controlled more Ukrainian land than it does now, about 20% at the time, versus just the 19% today. With the loss of that Russian peak coming after the events of the Kherson counteroffensive. But then go back a further 8 weeks before that, around August 2022, where Russia, of course, controlled even more land, just prior to the Kharkiv counteroffensive. But what would be even better for global awareness is the starting point, because why not? Where the Russian blitzkrieg at the very outset of the invasion held about 26% of Ukrainian land, which means, as of now, Russia is down roughly 7% from the peak of their full-scale invasion, forced to retreat from Sumy and Kyiv after a failed blitz marked by a logistical collapse, heavy losses, overstretched goals, and relentless Ukrainian counter-pressure. That's the one where Moscow spun that retreat as a gesture of goodwill. But all of these numbers we see here, the percentage figures, become a case of the rabbit hole going far deeper than that, because the 18.97% of Ukrainian land that Russia currently holds includes less than 12% that was actually captured after the full-scale invasion, where the rest went to the Donbass and Crimea before that. So in 1,272 days, Russia has, quite specifically, captured just 11.68% within this invasion. So ultimately, when the latest headlines emphasize Russia gaining 1% of Ukrainian land over 1,000 days, that'd in fact be the rosiest spin available for Moscow right now. But if that's as good as it gets, then it's nothing short of an embarrassment for the world's so-called Second Army, severely challenged with invading the largely open flatlands of the country right next door. And I never even got to mention the depletion of their Soviet-era war chest, but we did see some updated satellite snaps at the start of the video. Then to quickly round out the video today with an update, or an add-on, as mentioned from yesterday, as Ukraine has dropped the first video of its homegrown Flamingo cruise missile in action, and where we could think of it as Kyiv's latest sanctions package. Only this one travels nearly the speed of sound, carries a 1-ton warhead, and stretches 1,800 miles or 3,000 kilometers, which technically sneaks it into the intermediate range ballistic missile territory, except of course it's not a ballistic missile. Still, the math is simple. It can hit beyond the Urals, spook Moscow's most sensitive assets, and do so with speed, reach, and payload, all at a price tag far cheaper than hypersonics or traditional ballistic stock. Affordable leverage, Ukrainian style. The Kremlin has surely crossed paths with this news, and it may be just the kind of new leverage that motivates Putin to get to those top-level meetings. Well, at least a small chance. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Please continue to like, comment, subscribe, all of those wonderful things for the channel. I can't thank you enough. And I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers!